Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Happy Mother's Day. Great to see you guys. If I haven't met you before, my name is Andrew, and I'm the senior pastor here. I love that we get to celebrate Mother's Day together, whether you're joining us here in person or online. Thank you for being here with us. Get your Bibles, please. Get your Bibles, and if you don't have a Bible, I would encourage you to raise your hand. We have ushers that are going to come around our worship center right now that would love to bring you a Bible as a gift. All you do is raise your hand, and they'll hand it to you, and it's yours. We want you to take it home with you today and bring it back with you next week when you come. In your Bibles, turn to the 17th book of the Old Testament, the book of Esther. If you're looking for it, start at the beginning of your Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then you've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and a whole bunch of 1s and 2s. 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Turn to the book of Esther. If you are still having trouble finding that, at the beginning of your Bible to the table of contents, we'll give you a list of names in the Old Testament as well as the New. You're going to want to look in the Old Testament, look for the name Esther, and it'll give you a page number associated with it. Today, we're going to do something unique. We're actually going to study the timeline of an incredible role model, and more than one role model. We're going to see, as we look at observations and hopefully adopting characteristics and quality traits of some individuals and applying them to our lives, we're going to look at the life of a woman named Esther and her cousin turned father, Mordecai. A majority of our time is going to be spent in Esther chapter 7, but before that, we're going to study a timeline of Esther starting in Esther chapter 1. So I want to invite you to turn there right now, Esther chapter 1, and we're going to look at the first 4 verses together. Contextually, right before this, I was just at this historic monument. In 480 BC, there was a war that was a part of a collection of wars between Greece and the Persian Empire, known as the Greco-Persian Wars. In 480 BC, a lot of movies have been crafted around this war. This war evolves between Xerxes, who is king of Persia and had one of the largest provinces of the known world at that time, against a much smaller, outmanned battle group called the Spartans. Have you ever heard of the Spartans? Led under Leonidas. They have this huge historical monument there celebrating what would eventually become the Grecian victory. Outsized and outnumbered, the Grecians would stand their ground and ultimately, years and years later, would win out over the Persians. This that we're about to read is a historical narrative that takes place in real time at that time. Xerxes is king at the time of the War of Thermopylae, which is the War of 480 BC. And what we're about to read, is the evolution of that. Starting in verse 1 of chapter 1, these events happened in the days of King Xerxes, who reigned over 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. At that time, Xerxes ruled his empire from his royal throne at the fortress of Susa. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. He invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles of the provinces. The celebration lasted 180 days, a tremendous display of opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. We have to stop and ask and answer, in light of the Battle of Thermopylae and everything that's going on here, why this victorious celebration? And that's exactly what it was. This was a preemptive celebration by Xerxes for his military and for all to see his opulence and power put on display. At the end of a battle, during the middle of a war, they would celebrate each victory. They would have the warriors come home, and there would be a ruckus that would arise as a celebration of conquering whatever battle they were in. Well, this was preemptive on Xerxes' part. He was so sure of himself, of his authority, his power, his rule, his reign, and his military prowess, that he wanted to celebrate in advance a victory over the Grecians. So for 180 days, he throws the most ludicrous, the most ridiculous, the most opulent party you could imagine. And he celebrates for all the people in his provinces. There's wine at the ready, there's food, there's music, there's all kinds of pomp and circumstance. At the end of this 6-month period, Xerxes holds a 7-day special celebration for the nobles, princes, and people of high position and authority. He invites them into his palace, and as part of the celebration, he gives each one of them a uniquely crafted goblet full of the most precious metals and jewels in the world. Every one of them has their own distinct goblet, and the wine continues to flow, and he puts on display for everyone his opulence. Now, Xerxes is part of this celebration. He's got a trophy case of all that he's accomplished. And a part of his trophy case, he wants to add one more piece to the display for everyone, which is his wife, Queen Vashti. At the same time that Xerxes has got the party going on in the palace, Vashti's got a bunch of her friends together, and they're throwing their own party. Word gets back to Vashti by the king's eunuchs that he wants her to come with her crown, her royal headpiece, and wants to display her in front of all of the nobility as a part of his opulence. Well, Vashti isn't having it. She's no trophy wife. She tells the eunuchs to go back to King Xerxes and tell him, I'm not doing it. The guys go back to Xerxes and they say, hey, King, it's a bit of a hiccup. Vashti's she's not coming. We learn and we'll see that Xerxes got a bit of a temper. He throws temper tantrums. He loses his mind. Not only does he lose his mind, but his closest officials around him lose their minds. And let me explain to you why. The conversation starts and it evolves, and here's what it evolves into. Well, if Vashti, the queen of this empire, is able to talk back to the king and not follow his orders, what does that mean for our wives? That's literally what these guys are asking and beginning to try to answer for themselves. This is going to empower, this is going to be a woman's right movement. They're going to think that they don't have to do what we say, when we say, how we say, where we say. We can't have that. And they start feeding Xerxes all kinds of ideas. Xerxes is outraged and he brings them together and he says, all right, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, what can we do about this? They all huddle up and they say, we know what we should do. Let's tell Vashti she can never come in your presence again, and we're going to take away her leadership. She's not going to be the queen anymore. He said, that's a great idea. Let's do that. The eunuchs go back to Vashti, take her royal headpiece, and tell her, you can't see the king anymore. I'm sure she was tremendously disappointed. Sometime later, after Xerxes sobers up, literally, he's drunk when all this happens. After he sobers up, I imagine he's laying in his bed, and the thought occurs to him, I am the king of the greatest empire in the known world at this time, and I don't have a queen. That's a problem. That's a big problem. So what am I going to do? Well, he goes back to the same group of yahoos who told them what he should do last time because of this women's right movement that's about to evolve. And he says, what should I do? Well, the first idea was a pretty bad idea. But this idea seems a little more reasonable. They say, look, what we should do is hold a beauty contest for all the virgins of all the provinces in the entire kingdom. Every single woman in your kingdom should be brought before you, and you should get to pick and choose who you want to be your queen. Guys, this is the ultimate eliminate. That's what this is. And as Xerxes sits on his throne and thinks about all these beautiful women coming before him, and he gets to pick and choose who's going to be his queen, he said, yep, let's do it. So, an edict, in other words, kind of a statement, goes out to all provinces everywhere in every known language, and all the women begin to be collected. Amongst them is this young woman named Esther. Esther's got a unique story. She's a part of a Jewish community living in a non-Jewish collective. She lives with her cousin, Mordecai, who's about 50 years older than she is. And the reason is because as they have been exiled, her parents have lost their lives. Mordecai takes it upon himself to bring her in and treats Esther as his own daughter. So as the word starts to spread and people are beginning to talk amongst themselves about what's happening, Mordecai leans into Esther and he says, listen, they're going to come, they're going to take you, you're going to go to the palace, you're going to be presented before the king. Two things. Number one, don't tell them about your nationality. Hold tight to it. And number two, find the king's most trusted advisor, his most trusted eunuch, and do whatever that eunuch says. So, like all the others, Esther's collected. And for 12 months, each one of these women spends every day at the spa. Ladies, that is not an embellishment. 6 months of oils and special treatments, pedicures and manicures, getting their hair done, whatever they do with that loofah thing, all of it. And 6 months of beauty treatments, of makeup and clothes, all of it. Esther does exactly what her cousin turned father suggested. She goes to the king's most trusted eunuch and she says, tell me what I should do. Tell me what I should wear. Tell me where I should be. Tell me whatever it is I need to know. One after the next, each one of these women is brought before the king and he observes them, he interacts with them. And ultimately, Esther is a part of the collective that comes before King Xerxes. As a natural byproduct, he sees Esther, and the Bible says that he is overcome by her beauty. And he appoints her as his queen. He appoints her as his queen, and during this time, she begins to move into the palace and adopt to her new role as queen. Mordecai, this anxious cousin father, is near the king's quarters, his private quarters. Huge palace, but the king's got his own quarters, and while he's there are two eunuchs that become incredibly upset with Xerxes. Again, Xerxes he's a really irrational guy. He's got a huge temper, and so there's probably a lot of really justifiable reasons of why they could be upset. And I want you to turn in Esther chapter 2 and look at 3 verses with me, 21 through 23. Esther 2, 21, 22, and 23. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot, and he gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. So an investigation was made, and Mordecai's story was found to be true. The two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This was all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. It's in his chronicles. There would have been this pole, rather large, impaled into the ground, buried at an angle. And there, as a form of capital punishment, they would take the human body and would make a human skewer out of them. It was equal parts punishment, but it was also to set the tone that Xerxes was not to be toyed with. You didn't want that happening to you. Mordecai is there at the king's gate. We learn two things about Mordecai in this moment. One, we learn that he's been entrusted with some authority. He works for the palace. He's likely in a role where he's close to Xerxes, enough to be near his private quarters, where he overhears these two knucklehead eunuchs plotting to assassinate the king. He goes to his cousin/daughter, Esther, and he tells her everything that is about to happen. As they investigate, they find out that Mordecai's story is true. They have these two men impaled human skewer style, and they write down Mordecai's work in the King's Chronicles. Chapter 3, we are introduced to a new individual, one that is going to be the villain. Chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. Hold on to that. Hold on to Agagite. Over all of other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Ask why. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. There are only 2 books in the collective 66 books of the Bible that don't mention God by name. The implication is incredible. It's all there, but no name or characteristic of God is given. The first is the book of Esther. The second is the Song of Songs. In this book, while God is not mentioned by name, we see implication in that God is unique, special, specific, set apart, and we see a relationship much like Abraham in Romans chapter 4 verse 13, where he says that Abraham had a right relationship with God. We see that Mordecai has a relationship with God. So much so, and his relationship with God is so important that he is willing to disobey the king's order or the king's edict when it comes to worship. You say, what do you mean about worship? It just says that they need to bow down. Isn't that a sign of honor? Yeah. But to bow down in that culture was actually a form of worship. You'll see this in Daniel chapter 3 with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 3 men who refused to bow down and worship a false idol. You'll see it in Daniel chapter 6 when Daniel refuses to bow down in worship. And in fact, he goes up to his private quarters and continues to pray multiple times a day, as was a part of his faith. So, the fact that Mordecai is a Jew, the fact that Mordecai refuses to bow down in worship to Haman shows us the kind of relationship that he has to have with God. To oppose the king. And that's what this disobedience would be equated to as opposition. To oppose the king, one would have to have such a tremendously strong faith and relationship with God. Mordecai refuses to bow down. Haman, the Agagite, is an egomaniac. Do you know what that word means? It means that he is all about himself all the time and to an extreme. An egomaniac means that his ego is everything to him. As his friends come back and they start egging him on, pointing out the fact that this man, Mordecai, refuses to bow down, they start to stoke the fire, turning what was orange into what will become white hot. When this Agagite, it's a people group, Haman finds out that it's Mordecai, and not just Mordecai, but that Mordecai is a Jew, it becomes even worse. Here's the deal. If you want, in your own time, in your own personal study, go back and look at 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. We did a study through the book of 1 Samuel a couple of years ago. Incredible. As you go back and look at 1 Samuel 15, you're going to see that Saul, the first king of Israel, the Benjamite, is commissioned by God through the prophet Nathan to go to war with the Amalekites. And as he goes to war with the Amalekites, that he is to rain down fire on the Amalekites, literally to annihilate them, not to leave a single soul, human or animal or otherwise, with breath in their lungs. Well, the king of the Amalekites was a man named Agag. Saul, in his own pride, decides to annihilate everyone and almost everything in the Amalekites except King Agag and the spoils of war. He keeps King Agag as a justification for showing his victory in battle, which ends up being incredibly poor judgment. Nathan the prophet comes and says, man, you got that wrong. Excuse me, not Nathan, Samuel. You got that wrong. Really wrong. And as a byproduct, there's going to be a lot of war for a long time. This is a natural byproduct of disobedience from generations before. There is a vitriol. There is a hatred, a disdain between the Agagites, King Agag of the Amalekites, and the Jews. To the point where when Haman finds out that Mordecai's a Jew, he doesn't just want to have Haman killed. He wants to absolutely eradicate the Jews from the earth. He goes to King Xerxes, and he asks Xerxes, he coaxes Xerxes into signing an edict about a group that is adversarial toward the king, named the Jews. So they cast lots, and about a year later, permission is given that all of the Jews over all of the provinces can be annihilated. This is permission given for a mass genocide on a people group. Permission given for a mass genocide on a people group. And this man, Haman, is the forefather of this in that time. Well, at the time, people are mourning everywhere. It's not yet, but it's coming. They're about a year out. The Jews are distracted. They're distraught. They're torn up. When Mordecai finds out about this, and they find out because in the same way that edict went out over all 127 provinces in every known language and tongue, asking for all the women to come before the king so that he can pick his next bride, another edict goes out, one that cannot be revoked, one that was signed with the king's signet ring, stating that a year out, any Jew that was there would be annihilated. They put him on all the street corners, all the lampposts. They announce it everywhere. Mordecai learns about this, and he goes into a state of mourning. Not panic, but mourning. He rips his clothes. He puts on burlap. He pours ashes over his head. This is the sign of death. He is signifying that this decision by the king via Haman and his hatred will be the death of all of the Jews. Now, Esther is up in her palace. She sees her cousin. She sees that he's mourning, he's weeping. And as somebody that she's close to, she's concerned about him. So she sends her trusted eunuch to go and talk to Mordecai and find out what he's so upset about. What happened? Well, Mordecai tells her everything. Haman is so angry, he wants to kill the Jews, and he got King Xerxes to agree to it. And there's an edict that's been sent out. It's law. It can't be revoked. It can't be overturned. And so a year from now, we're all dead. And Esther says, yeah, that's horrible. But what do you want me to do about it? I can't go before King Xerxes because the law is that I can only go before Xerxes if he calls for me. Well, I guess there's one exemption, she says. There's one exemption to the law. If I go before King Xerxes and he extends his gold scepter to me, then I can live. But you have to understand that what you're asking me to do by interceding, by stepping into this, is it's a death sentence. I could lose my life. I could lose everything. In the most famous verse in the collective whole of Esther, chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, here's Mordecai's response. Mordecai sent this reply to Esther. Don't think for a moment that because you're in this palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. Those are the words that fall back into Esther's lap. And in that moment, she has to make a decision. And she does two things. The first is she tells her eunuch to go back to Mordecai and say, okay, I'm going to do it. But two things have to happen. Number one, I need you to have all the Jews everywhere praying for me. I'm going to fast for 3 days. I'm not going to take any food or anything. 3 days. And after 3 days, I'm going to go before the king and I'm going to present to him what you're asking me, even though it could mean my very life. And so I need to make sure that every Jew everywhere is praying for me. And for the next 3 days, I'm going to pray and I'm going to fast and we're going to seek God together. Well, the time comes and goes, and 3 days later, Esther goes before the king. And I imagine, ladies, that her heart is beating through her chest. I imagine that her skin is red, flushed from blood pouring to her extremities from the accelerated heart rate, knowing that her life is on the line. And as she enters the king's courtroom, the king's private quarters, the king's inner circle, Everybody is staring at her, wondering how the king is going to respond, wondering what it is Esther needs. And as she kneels before him, the king extends his gold scepter. And he says, what is it, Esther? Up to half the kingdom. If you ask for it, it's yours. Ladies, which one of you, if your husband says, what do you want? Up to half of our retirement and bank account right now, it's yours. You wouldn't say, have you heard of Louis Vuitton? Gucci? Esther said, hey, if it pleases the king, like if you think it's a good idea, I want you to join me at a banquet that I'm going to throw for you tomorrow. And bring Haman, the most trusted man in your court, the one who has got more authority than anybody else, second only to you. And so they throw this party. It's an opulent party. There's food everywhere. There's dancing. There's people. And Haman is sitting at the king's table with Esther and the king. At the end of the party, Haman goes outside on his way home, and there he is. There he is. Everybody else is bowing down, but there's Mordecai, that thorn in his flesh. He refuses to bow down, and Haman gets home, and he begins to tell his wife and his closest friends about all of his wealth, about all of his children, about all of his successes. But there's this one thing. Esther 5. Look at verses 12 and 13 with me. Esther 5, verses 12 and 13. Haman added, that's not all. Queen Esther invited only me and the king himself to the banquet she prepared for us. And she's invited me to dine with her and the king again tomorrow. Then he added, but this is all worth nothing. This is worth nothing as long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting there at the palace gate. At the end of the first banquet, King Xerxes looks at Esther and he says, Esther, all right, party's almost over. What is it you really want? Like, why are we here? And she says, if it pleases the king, let's run this back tomorrow. Let's have another banquet, only this time I just want you to bring Xerxes. He says, you bet. Or excuse me, Haman. Haman, in his excitement, in his enthusiasm, runs out the doors. And as he runs, he sees this man, Mordecai, who refuses to obey him. He goes home. He's excited about all the good in his life, but then he's outraged that he will not concede, Mordecai, that he will not bow down. Well, his wife and his closest friends, they say, yeah, that's unacceptable. That can't happen. What you should do is get a 75-foot long telephone pole, sharpen the end of it like a number 2 pencil, put it in your front yard, and have the king give you permission to make Mordecai a human skewer right in front of your house so that everyone can see what happens if they play with you. You're not to be messed with. You're not to be trifled with. You're not to be toyed with. And then you have a trophy. Every day when you walk out of your house, there he is, the human skewer. That night, King Xerxes is laying in bed and he can't sleep. Melatonin's not working. So he does what all the kings of that culture and time do. He calls for an orator to come and to read his chronicles, an account of everything good that he has ever experienced or done in his kingdom. He's laying there. Ladies, I want you to imagine with me for just a moment. There's your husband in bed, all snuggled up. He can't sleep. Warm glass of milk hasn't touched it. And he says, hey, Tim says, hey, Jess, can you go downstairs and get the chronicles? We've been married almost 30 years. I just want you to read about how great I am. About all the good things I've ever done for everyone. Tim, try that tonight and let me know how it works, okay? Yeah. So there's Xerxes is laying in bed, and they're going through a whole chronicle of his kingdom. And then there's this account about this time that 2 of the king's closest eunuchs just outside of his private quarters almost killed him. But that plan was thwarted by a Jew named Mordecai. Look at this. Look at chapter 6, verse 3. As the king hears this, chapter 6:3, he says, what reward or recognition did we ever give Mordecai for this? The king asked. His attendants replied, nothing has been done for him. At that time, the king shoots out of bed, and he says, who is just outside my door? Well, Haman had come running from his house with this new idea from Zeresh, his wife, and his closest friends about the 75-foot skewer in the front yard. And he's going to knock at the king's door. Before he can make the first contact, the door flings open, and he runs in about to tell the king about Mordecai and get permission to kill this man. And the king says to Haman, hey, what should be done for the king's most respected individual? Somebody who has done so much for the king that he wants to honor him in the highest position and hold him in the highest regard. Haman, egomaniac, remember, all about me all the time. He thinks to himself, who else could the king be talking about but this guy? Me. It's all about me. It's all about I. I don't know that song. I don't know why. That's all I got. If it's a bad song, I apologize. That's all I know. I won't do that next service. This guy comes up with the most radical plan. Knowing for certain that it's him. He says, you know what I would do, king, if I were you? You're asking, so I'm just going to tell you. I would take that man that you want to honor, and I'd put one of your purple royal robes over his shoulders. And I'd take one of your crowns, position it right on top of his head. And take your signet ring that demonstrates your power, your authority, and put it on his finger. And then I would put him on one of your horses, the king's horse. And then I would have one of your other advisors take him through the city streets with a parade. A lot of pomp and circumstance, a lot of noise, a lot of announcements. Here comes the man that the king wants to honor. Here comes the man that the king admires. Yeah, that's what I would do, king. Xerxes says, that's brilliant. Yes, let's do that. And imagine the surprise on Haman's face when the king follows up with, yes, let's do that. Immediately with, go get Mordecai and do everything as you've just said. And you take him around. What? Yeah. Go get Mordecai, the Jew. Tell him to take off his burlap sack, clean off the ash off his forehead. And I want you to put one of my robes on him. And I want you to put a crown on his head. Put me here. Here's my signet ring, okay? I want you to take my signet ring. I want you to put it on his finger. And I want you to take him, put him on one of my horses and parade him through the city streets and make a big production. Announce, here's what happens to the man that the king respects and admires most. How humble do you think that pie was? So Haman has to go to Mordecai. Hey, so here's what the king wants to do. He wants to honor you. Here's a robe, here's a crown, here's a ring, here's the horse. And he takes him through the city streets, just as he had suggested. At the end of the night, after he puts the horse back into the stall, he runs home to Zeresh like a big baby. And he says, you're not going to believe what my day was like. You want to hear about my day at the office? Yeah. You're home with the kids. I get it. Stressful. I understand. Stepped on some Legos. Sorry that happened. Let me tell you about my day. And as he begins to go into all that had just happened, Zeresh, not smart, but she's not the dumbest person either, starts to add up some of these pieces. And she says, whoa. Haman, stop. Listen, you've got to stop opposing Mordecai. In fact, you've got to stop opposing all the Jews, because everything bad happening to you right now is a direct tie to the Jews. Anybody who opposes the Jews is going to lose their life. As she's in the middle of telling him to stop messing with the Jews and knock on the door, it's the king's eunuchs. They come to get Haman because the second banquet is underway. Haman is taken by police escort to the king's quarters, where he sees Queen Esther and he sees Xerxes. And you can imagine he can't even enjoy this moment because of the anxiety in his heart. Chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. On the second occasion, while they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, tell me what you want, Queen Esther. What is your request? I'll give it to you, even if it's half the kingdom. And Queen Esther replied, if I found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial a matter to warrant disturbing the king. Xerxes, who would do such a thing, he demanded. Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you? Verse 6, Esther replied, this wicked Haman is our adversary and enemy. Hard gulp, Adam's apple protruding. Haman grew pale with fright before the king and queen. Then the king, temper tantrum, jumps to his feet in rage and went out into the garden palace. Temper tantrum, but apparently he started some therapy because he goes outside to count to 10. He doesn't just react in the moment. He goes outside. He's walking along the rose garden and he's trying to collect his thoughts. Haman, however, this is the middle part of chapter 7, verse 7, stayed behind to plead for his life with Queen Esther, for he knew that the king intended to kill him. In despair, he fell on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. The king exclaimed, will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes? And as soon as the king spoke, his attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Then Harbona, one of the king's eunuchs, said, Haman has set up a sharpened pole that stands 75 feet tall in his own courtyard. He intended to use it to impale Mordecai, the man who saved the king from assassination. Then impale Haman on it, the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the pole that he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. All right, we don't have time to get into all of the king's issues. That pole that he had set up to make Mordecai a human skewer will end up being his demise. And there's a whole lot of lessons we can talk about when it comes to pride, arrogance, prejudice, our own personal agendas, doing things our way, egos. As I look at this, I really want to kind of encourage you. There's 10 chapters in total in the book of Esther. We've just covered the first 7. On your own, go home and read chapter 8, 9, and 10. The king can't overturn the edict that he had put into place about a year before, so the Jews are still up for genocide. But he gives permission for the Jews to defend themselves, unheard of. God's favor falls on the Jews go to war with all of the Persians start dropping like flies. The Jews went out. Mordecai ends up second in command. He actually ends up inheriting all of Haman's property and possessions. Esther is celebrated, and the Jews are victorious. There are 3 things, 3 lessons that I see, at least 3, that we can glean from this incredible historical narrative. And each one of these applies to both Esther and Mordecai. The first lesson that I think we can observe on our way to adopting it for ourselves and applying it in our own lives is this. They were people of integrity. C.S. Lewis said it this way. Integrity is doing the right thing even when no one is looking. Esther could have stayed. She could have stayed put in her palatial grounds, living the high life, MTV Cribs style. Before that, lifestyle of the rich and famous. I lost 2/3 of you when I said that. But she was a woman of integrity. It was the hard thing, but it was the right thing. Mordecai, he could have gathered together all the Jews and come up with a plan to flee the province. But he didn't. He did the right thing. These are individuals of integrity. Integrity is a quality trait that is defined by honesty and sound morals and conviction. By honesty, sound morals, and conviction. It's easy for most of us to do the right thing when people are looking, but how difficult is it to do the right thing when no one is paying attention? When you can get away with it. I have a tattered $20 bill that I keep in my office. It's partially torn, and it was wrinkled up. About 5 years ago, we still had a school here, and I was on my way into the office, and as I walked in, I saw this $20 bill in the hedges along the way. And as I grabbed that $20 bill, I came into Terry Hodson, the owner and operator of the church, and I said to Terry, hey, I found this $20 bill outside. I don't know who it belongs to, but if anybody's looking for a $20 bill, have them come to me. And she announced it to the staff, and nothing ever came of it. Now, I could go to Chipotle and get at least a burrito bowl and a half with $20. Double chicken, double steak, some white rice, no dairy, and absolutely no guacamole. I'm not allergic, it's just disgusting. To this day, that $20 bill sits in my office as a reminder to me that integrity is doing the right thing when nobody's looking. It's not my $20. It's a simple, subtle reminder, but it's really important to me. What about you? Are you a man or are you a woman of integrity? Do you do the right thing most of the time when people are watching, or will you do the right thing when nobody's paying attention? How about at work? Are you a man or a woman of integrity? How about what you allow your eyes to see on social media and the internet? Are you a man or a woman of integrity? How about the way you spend your money? Are you a man or a woman of integrity? How about the way you treat your children, not in public but in private? Are you a man or a woman of integrity? One of the three primary attributes that I see from both Mordecai and from Esther is that when everything was on the line and no one was looking, both of these people were individuals of integrity. Here's what Scripture declares about integrity. Proverbs 10:9, write it down, go back on your own. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Whoever walks in integrity walks securely, but whoever takes crooked paths will be found out. Friends, as followers of Jesus, we are called to exhibit integrity in our lives. The second I is intercession. Intercession. If you're not familiar with that word, I want to read a quote to you from the famed missionary worker Elizabeth Elliot. Then comes intercession, the hardest work in the world. The giving of one's self, time, strength, energy, and attention to the needs of others in a way that no one but God sees, no one but God will do anything about, and no one but God will ever reward you for. Intercession is praying for others. And in order to pray for others, intentionally, deliberately, specifically, it is to elevate their needs above our own. It's to cancel out the thoughts of self and replace it with thoughts of others, to step in on their stead or in their stead and on their behalf before the throne room of God and intercede, asking for God's will to be done in their life, asking, interceding, praying for those people. In the midst of all the turmoil and chaos, Esther asks for two things to be done. One, prayer, and two, fasting. She goes to Mordecai and she said, I need you to do, I cannot do this on my own strength. I cannot do this by my own power, and I certainly can't do this under my own authority. What I need is I need to know that we have a body, a community, a collective of people that are praying with me and for me. Would you go and intercede on my behalf? Mordecai could do nothing else in that moment to change the trajectory of that moment. He couldn't go before Xerxes. He couldn't undo the edict. He could do nothing else in that moment. Where most of us would feel helpless, there was hope. And she said, the most powerful and the most profound thing you can do is pray for me. You know, I know as somebody who's a doer, I'm a get stuff done kind of guy. I'm not really great when my wife comes home or when I come home and she's telling me about problems, because I'm terrible at it. I want to fix it. I want to resolve it. I want to solve it. But here's how you do this. Here's how you talk to that person. Here's how you address this situation. And my wife has had to learn over the years to tell me, right now, I don't need you to be my pastor. I just need you to be my husband. And I'm like, dang it. I was doing such a good job telling you how to fix this. One of the greatest gifts that any of us can offer anyone, anywhere, anytime, is our commitment to praying for them, to intercede on their behalf, to know that the authority that is greater than all of the earth will be sought on your behalf is a tremendous radical gift of love. Let me read this quote one more time. Then comes intercession, the hardest work in the world. The hardest work in the world, she says, the giving of one's self, their time, their strength, their energy, and attention to the needs of others in a way that no one but God sees, no one but God will do anything about, and no one but God will ever reward you for. 1 Timothy 2:1 says this, write it down, study it, 1 Timothy 2:1. I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people. Ask God to help them, intercede on their behalf, and give thanks for them. Let me read it one more time. I urge you, first of all, to pray for all people and ask God to help them, to intercede on their behalf and give thanks for them. And finally, the third thing that we can observe, adopt, and apply in our lives is intentionality. Intentionality. Number one, integrity. Number two, intercession. But number three is intentionality. How many of you, if you're honest, you are a fire ready aim kind of person, and you chalk it up to a person that takes action? You see something and you address it. You see a need, you hear about a need, and you just go after it. Or you want something and you go after it. You don't count the cost in advance. You just go and get what you. In fact, that's how you've gotten where you're at in life right now, is you've just done it. You've pulled them bootstraps up real high and real tight. You've just done it. But is that what God has wanted you to do? And is that how God wanted you to do it? Both Mordecai and Esther have demonstrated a tremendous amount of intentionality, of purpose, doing what God had called them to do on purpose, with a purpose, for his purpose. I know that life, all too often, and especially our faith, look at me, all too often we treat our faith the same way that we treat brushing our teeth. You say, what? Brushing your teeth? Yeah, think about that. When was the last time you stood in the mirror in the morning with your toothbrush, your floss, your mouthwash, and as you were brushing your teeth, you counted all the costs, all the reasons why you were doing this? Well, I'm doing this because I want good hygiene. I don't want halitosis. Don't need my breath smelling like something died up in there. I want to make sure that I have good enamel, a strong gum line, that when I go to the dentist and they start poking on that thing, it doesn't bleed, and that they don't develop any cavities. And no, the truth is, most of you are still half asleep, and you brush your teeth maybe in the morning and hopefully at night. Now, as you go there, you grab your toothbrush, you throw some toothpaste on it, and you're sitting there, and as you brush your teeth, you're already thinking about the next thing. I do it. I always do something else besides brush my teeth when I'm brushing my teeth. This morning, brushing my teeth, 4:30 in the morning. And while I'm brushing my teeth, I go and I pick out my outfit for the day. Brushing my teeth, I pull out my outfit. And then I come back and I spit and rinse and repeat. And then I go and I get my socks, and well, today I didn't, but too many of us approach our faith and the things that God calls us to haphazardly. We just go through the motions. And I believe with every fiber of my being that God wants us to count the costs. He wants us to slow down, figure out what his will is for our lives, and align our will with his will. Align our ways with his will. Too often we develop what we want and then ask God to bless it. Friends, that's sin. God is not a genie in a bottle, and he doesn't work for you. He's the sovereign Lord of all creation. Was, is, and forever will be. And the best we can do, the most humble thing we can do, is to go before him and ask, Lord, what is your will for my ways? How do you want me to spend my time? How do you want me to spend my energy? How do you want me to spend my efforts? What do you want for me, Lord? What do you want from me? And then be quiet long enough to listen and be strong enough to obey. Esther developed a plan. She said, pray for me. I'm going to fast. I'm going to go before the king. I'm going to set up not one but two banquets. We'll see what happens. She had intentionality in her approach. This week, I beg you to go and live a life of integrity, of intercession, and intentionality. And watch how God shows up and shows off in your life.